The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. Snowflakes swirled like tiny daggers in the air, cutting into Jeon Kim's exposed cheeks as she trudged through the thick snow, her boots sinking deep with every step. The sky above was a heavy gray, the kind that warned of an impending blizzard. She pulled her worn-out coat tighter around her, cursing the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Jeon had ventured further from her small cabin than usual, desperate to gather enough firewood before nightfall. The forest at the base of the mountain was eerily silent, except for the occasional groan of the wind pushing against the towering pines. She adjusted the axe slung across her back, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. Then she heard it, a faint sound barely audible over the wind. A low, guttural moan. She stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, a weak, pain-laced groan. Her eyes darted around, scanning the snowy expanse. The sound was close, but with the wind screaming through the trees, it was impossible to pinpoint its exact direction. "Hello," she called out, her voice uncertain. No answer. Jeon hesitated for only a moment before pushing forward, her instincts screaming that something, or someone, was in trouble. She moved cautiously, her boots crunching against the ice-crusted snow. Then, through the thick white blanket covering the ground, she spotted something unusual, a dark shape barely visible beneath a mound of snow. Her heart leaped into her throat. She rushed forward, falling to her knees beside the figure, brushing away the fresh snow. Her breath caught when she saw the man's face, pale, his dark hair frozen at the edges. His clothes, though clearly expensive, were torn and soaked through. His lips were nearly blue, his eyes half closed. "Hey, can you hear me?" Jeon shook his shoulder, but he barely reacted. "Sir, wake up!" A weak groan escaped his lips, his fingers twitching slightly as if fighting against the cold's deadly grip. Jeon leaned in closer. "You need to wake up. If you stay out here, you'll die." His lips parted, and for a moment, she thought he would speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. "Help!" Jeon clenched her jaw, quickly assessing the situation. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, blood staining the snow beneath him. A broken leg in this weather. He wouldn't last much longer. Cursing under her breath, she grabbed his arm and tried to pull him up. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight against the snow. "Come on," she gritted her teeth, shifting his arm over her shoulder. "I'm not leaving you here." With all the strength she could muster, she heaved him up, staggering under his weight. Every step was a battle against the deep snow and the icy wind cutting through her coat. The man groaned in pain as she dragged him forward, his head lolling against her shoulder. She didn't know who he was or how he had ended up here, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting him home before the cold claimed him forever. By the time she reached the cabin, her muscles burned with exhaustion. She kicked the door open, nearly collapsing as she pulled him inside. The warmth of the cabin was a stark contrast to the icy wilderness outside. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. With great effort, she maneuvered him onto the old couch near the fireplace. His body was ice cold, his fingers stiff with frostbite. She quickly grabbed a pile of blankets, wrapping them around him before kneeling beside him to examine his injuries. His face was gaunt, his features sharp even in unconsciousness. His expensive coat was torn, the fabric stiff with frozen blood. Her eyes landed on his leg. A deep gash ran along his shin, the wound looking angry and raw against his pale skin. Jeon cursed under her breath. If it got infected, he wouldn't survive. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the urgency. She cleaned the wound with warm water, wincing at the sight of the deep cut. He stirred slightly, a faint groan escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. After wrapping his leg tightly with fresh bandages, she let out a slow breath. Now all she could do was wait. Hours passed. Jeon sat in the old wooden chair across from the couch, watching the man with wary eyes. His breathing had grown steadier, his face no longer ghostly pale. The firelight cast soft shadows over his features, highlighting the rough stubble on his jaw, the strong lines of his face. He didn't look like a local. Who was he? And what the hell had he been doing in the middle of nowhere? Just as her mind swirled with questions, a hoarse voice broke the silence. "Where am I?" Jeon shot up, moving closer. The man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing deep, stormy eyes that darted around the room in confusion. "You're in my cabin," she said, keeping her voice firm but calm. "I found you half dead in the snow." He groaned, his hand moving to his temple as if trying to piece together his thoughts. I don't remember." Jiyeon narrowed her eyes. What's your name? He hesitated, blinking against the firelight. Then, after a long pause, he rasped, Minjun Lee. Something about the name stirred a distant familiarity in her, but she couldn't quite place it. You were in bad shape when I found you, she said, crossing her arms. Your leg was messed up, and you had no supplies. No proper gear. What happened to you? Minjun exhaled sharply, struggling to sit up. Pain flashed across his face, and he clutched his bandaged leg. I don't know. I remember the cold, the storm. Then, he shook his head, frustration darkening his features. Everything else is a blur. Jiyeon studied him carefully. She wasn't sure if he was lying or genuinely confused. Either way, something about his situation didn't sit right with her. Then his expression suddenly shifted, from confusion to alarm. My phone, he muttered, patting the pockets of his torn coat. My wallet, where the hell? Jiyeon's stomach tightened. They weren't on you when I found you. Minjun's jaw clenched. No, I had them. I remember, I had my phone, my wallet, my watch. They're gone. A heavy silence settled between them. Jiyeon had seen enough in her life to know what this meant. Someone had taken his things. And in a place as unforgiving as the Korean wilderness, that didn't happen by accident. You think someone robbed you? She asked, keeping her voice even. Minjun let out a bitter laugh. Seems like the only explanation, doesn't it? Jiyeon frowned. If someone had left him out there to die, that meant whoever did this had wanted him gone. But why? She glanced at the fire, the flames flickering as if mirroring her thoughts. Minjun Lee, a man with expensive clothes, a sharp look in his eyes, and no memory of how he ended up half frozen on the mountain. Something about him didn't add up. And yet, despite the unease curling in her stomach, she couldn't turn him away. Not yet. Faison smirked. Haven't eaten in a while, have you? Minjun frowned. I don't actually remember. Well, you're in luck. Breakfast is almost ready. A few minutes later, Jiyeon set down 3 wooden bowls on the table. Inside was a thick stew made from what looked like dried venison, root vegetables, and wild herbs. It was nothing fancy, just simple rustic food, but it smelled good. Minjun hesitated before picking up the wooden spoon and taking a bite. The stew was hot, rich with the deep earthy flavors of slow-cooked meat and wild seasonings. It was unlike anything he had ever eaten before. Not the refined meals of 5-star restaurants, nor the processed food of city life. It was real, unpretentious, nourishing in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. He glanced at Jiyeon, who ate with the same quiet efficiency she seemed to apply to everything. You live like this every day? He asked after a moment. Jiyeon looked up. Like what? Hunting for food, making your own medicine, chopping wood just to keep warm. She shrugged. Yeah, it's not easy, but it's life. Minjun shook his head, stirring his stew absent-mindedly. I don't think I've ever had to work that hard for anything. Jiyeon's grandmother snorted. Doesn't surprise me. Minjun chuckled under his breath. I bet. Jiyeon watched him for a moment. There was something strange about seeing a man who clearly came from wealth sitting at their modest table, eating their simple food. He was out of place here, yet something about the way he was looking at his bowl, as if reevaluating everything he had ever known, made her wonder. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he seemed. The days passed slowly in the Kim cabin, marked by the rhythmic crackling of the fire and the muffled howls of the wind outside. Minjun's strength was returning, though his injured legs still kept him from moving around too much. Despite the discomfort, he found himself strangely at ease in the quiet simplicity of the place. Jiyeon was always busy, chopping wood, checking traps, preparing food, and tending to her grandmother. She never once complained, never hesitated to get her hands dirty. Minjun had never met anyone like her before. One evening, as the fire flickered warmly in the hearth, Minjun sat up on the couch, stretching his sore limbs. Jiyeon was at the small wooden table, carefully sewing a tear in her coat. The room smelled of pine and smoke, scents he was beginning to associate with safety. I need to tell you something, he said finally, breaking the silence. Jiyeon didn't look up. You're not secretly a murderer, are you? Minjun let out a small chuckle. No, but I am rich. That made her glance up, one eyebrow raised. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. My full name is Minjun Lee. I own a company called Lee Enterprises. We specialize in real estate and private investments. I have offices in Seoul, New York, and Tokyo. Jiyeon blinked. Okay. Minjun waited for more of a reaction, shock, curiosity, something. But she just shrugged and went back to sewing. That's it? He asked, incredulous. She didn't even bother looking at him this time. What do you want me to say? Well, I don't know. Minjun gestured vaguely. Most people would be a little more surprised. Jiyeon tied off the thread and bit it between her teeth before finally meeting his gaze. It doesn't change anything. Minjun stared at her, genuinely baffled. You're telling me you don't care at all? She sighed and leaned back in her chair. Look, Minjun, maybe in your world, money means everything. But here, it won't light a fire, it won't feed you, and it sure as hell won't save you when you're half dead in a snowstorm. Minjun opened his mouth, but she wasn't finished. Out there, you might be some big-shot CEO, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the world beyond the cabin walls. But here, you're just a guy who got lost in the snow. The words hit him harder than he expected. His entire life, people had treated him differently because of his wealth, his employees, his so-called friends, even the women he dated. He was used to a world where money dictated power, where his name alone commanded respect. But Jiyeon didn't give a damn. For the first time in his life, Minjun felt something unfamiliar. Humility. He leaned back against the couch, staring at the fire, his thoughts tangled. Jiyeon, unfazed, stood and stretched. I'm going to bed. Try not to overthink it too much, city boy. Minjun watched her disappear into the small adjoining room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been living his entire life wrong. The morning air was crisp and biting, thick with the scent of pine and fresh snow. Minjun stepped out of the cabin, leaning against the wooden railing as he took in the endless expanse of wilderness before him. The towering mountains stood against the pale blue sky, their peaks dusted in white, untouched by time. It was a sight unlike anything he had ever seen in Seoul. A world that belonged not to men in suits but to the earth itself. Jiyeon emerged from the side of the cabin, an old axe slung over her shoulder. She glanced at him, then at the firewood pile near the door. If you're going to stand there all day, at least make yourself useful, she said, tossing him a pair of gloves. Minjun barely caught them before they hit his chest. Chopping wood? Really? Jiyeon smirked. Unless you'd rather freeze tonight. Minjun sighed, pulling on the gloves. He had spent his life making billion-dollar deals, managing entire companies. He had never chopped a single piece of firewood. But as he followed Jiyeon to the clearing behind the cabin, he realized something strange. For the first time, he wanted to try. Before, he had people for that. But now, sitting in this cabin, seeing the world through Jiyeon Kim's eyes, things felt different. The negotiations had been intense, he admitted. Not everyone wanted me to gain control of the mine. There were other investors, competitors, people who stood to gain if I disappeared. Jiyeon leaned forward. You think someone tried to get rid of you? Minjun Lee clenched his jaw. Not just someone. I think it was my own assistant. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Jiyeon Kim, his right-hand man, the person who handled his schedule, his travel, his security. The person he trusted most in his business. And the last person he had seen before waking up in the snow. The memory returned in flashes. The private meeting in a luxury lodge near Fairbanks. Jiyeon Kim standing by the fireplace, reviewing final documents. Everything is set, Jiyeon had said, pouring Minjun a drink. By this time tomorrow, the mine will be yours. Minjun had taken the glass, nodding. Good. I don't want any surprises. Jiyeon had smiled. Of course. You can always trust me. Then darkness. A sharp pain in his skull. The bitter taste of something in his drink. And then cold. Ice. The blinding white of the snow. Minjun gritted his teeth, his hands curling into fists. He must have drugged me. Left me out there, knowing I wouldn't survive. By the time they declared me missing, the deal would have already been signed without me. Jiyeon's expression hardened. So he tried to kill you for money? Minjun let out a bitter laugh. That's the world I come from. Jiyeon shook her head, disgust flashing in her dark eyes. Unbelievable. And to think you actually trusted this guy. Minjun exhaled slowly. Yeah, I did. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. I can't let him get away with this. Jiyeon studied him for a long moment. So what are you going to do? Minjun looked up, his eyes dark with determination. I have to go back. A silence fell between them. Jiyeon leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Right. Of course. Go back to your world of power and money. Minjun frowned. I don't have a choice. If I don't stop him, he'll take everything I've built. He'll win. Jiyeon's lips pressed into a thin line. And what happens after that? You fix your business, put the bad guy in jail, and go back to your fancy penthouse in Seoul. Minjun hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. All he knew was that he couldn't let this betrayal stand. But now, looking at Jiyeon, at this life he had come to respect in ways he never expected. A strange unease settled in his chest. Jiyeon let out a breath, shaking her head. Look, I get it. You have unfinished business. But just don't forget what you learned here. Minjun met her gaze, and for the first time, he realized he didn't want to leave. Not really. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. I will come back. Jiyeon looked at him, searching his face for any sign of a lie. Then she nodded just once. You better. And for the first time in his life, Minjun Lee knew he had something worth coming back for. The day Minjun left, the sky was a dull gray, thick clouds rolling over the mountains like a heavy curtain. The air was colder than usual, or maybe it only felt that way to Jiyeon as she stood outside the cabin, watching him prepare to leave. He was dressed in borrowed winter gear, bundled against the elements, but something about him already looked different, like he didn't quite belong here anymore. His injured leg had healed enough for him to travel, though he still moved with a slight limp. The sled dogs, restless and eager, barked in anticipation of the journey ahead. Jiyeon crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral. You sure you're ready for this, city boy? Minjun smirked, though there was something sad in his eyes. I don't think I have a choice. She exhaled, her breath forming a small cloud in the freezing air. I guess not. An elderly woman standing a few feet away gave Minjun a hard look. Be careful out there, boy. The world ain't as forgiving as this place. Minjun nodded. I know. He turned back to Jiyeon, hesitating. There were a million things he wanted to say, but none of them felt right. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into her hand. It was a silver compass, worn with age. Jiyeon frowned. What's this? My grandfather's, Minjun said. He used to say it would always point him home. Jiyeon looked up, meeting his gaze. And where's home for you? Minjun hesitated. Then, softly, he said, I don't know yet. Jiyeon swallowed hard, curling her fingers around the compass. You better figure it out. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Minjun took a step back and climbed onto the sled. With a sharp command to the dogs, they lurched forward, kicking up a flurry of snow. Jiyeon stood there, unmoving, watching as he disappeared into the white horizon. And for the first time since she was a child, she felt something strange. Something that scared her more than any storm. She missed him. Weeks passed slowly. Jiyeon threw herself into work, hunting, chopping wood, fixing what needed fixing. She told herself she didn't care that Minjun hadn't sent word. But every morning, she found herself glancing toward the trail he had left on. And every night, she found herself staring at the small silver compass, turning it over in her fingers as if it held some kind of answer. Then, one evening, everything changed. Jiyeon was outside stacking firewood when she heard the distant sound of sled dogs approaching. She turned, expecting one of the village traders. But instead, a man she had never seen before stepped off the sled. And so the story continues, unfolding between two worlds, one of wealth and power, and one of untamed wilderness. But in the end, Jiyeon and Minjun will learn that true riches are not found in what we own, but in the people who stand beside us. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next time with more exciting and sincere stories. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single story.